Welcome to another episode of Women in Family Business. We are WIFB, the global initiative for women to share their stories and expertise on matters related to the family enterprise. In this episode, Meghan Juday, Chair of Ideal Industries Inc., Governance Advisor and founder of the Lodis Forum, and Marina Vaughan Spitzy, founder of legacy planning firm Tecolote Advisory and fifth-generation family business Stakeholder, talk to me about the results of our recent study entitled Women in Power, for which we interviewed near a dozen women who told their stories of bias and success in the family enterprise. We discussed the emotional and professional challenges women confront when first taking on a leadership role in their family firms, as well as the strategies that can help empower them. Whether gender bias exists within the world's family enterprises has been unequivocally answered. Yet despite the gender barriers they face, or possibly because of them, women are amplifying their voices and advocating for themselves within their family enterprises and the male-dominated boardrooms of businesses globally. Many women are actively demanding the change they want to see and the resources they need to excel as they increasingly recognize and understand the value they bring to every organization, and maybe most especially the family business. Enjoy this episode with Marina and Meghan. What part of the kinds of challenges that women faced joining their family enterprises sort of stood out to you as something that was quite surprising to you that you did not expect to hear when you were doing the interviews?
I think most primarily for me was, first of all, how incredibly capable all these women were. And we'll talk more about the impact they've had on their organizations, but it's been substantial and transformational. So that's kind of the backdrop. But for me, the biggest thing was really that they weren't the first choice, many of them. They were essentially overlooked, sometimes undereducated or patted on the head and, don't you worry about it. We'll take care of this for you. And then there were some very tragic reasons why many of these women came into power. And then others, less tragic, but still somewhat disruptive for the family system. I think a lot of them kind of expressed the sentiment, if I hadn't been overlooked at a younger age, first of all, this job would be a lot easier for me. And second of all, I could have made a bigger contribution earlier on in my career. So most of these women, because they weren't their first choice, went out and did something else and actually kind of proved their worth out in the bigger world, and then somehow came back with some credibility and were able to, be handed the reins.
What about you, Marina? What stood out to you in terms of the challenges that they faced?
I'd have to reiterate Meghan's point about the preparation, about the succession planning. 5 of the 11 women who we spoke to had an unexpected entry into the family business. And so I think this is really key. It's not just that as when they were younger, they were offered different educational opportunities. In many ways, they had this golden ticket of time outside of the business to find themselves and find their own voices. But it's the problem of being ill-prepared to enter a position. It's going to affect the quality of their performance. It just makes it a harder place to start from. And these women, yes, we're going to talk about the impact. What they achieved once they were there is remarkable. But it doesn't matter what kind of structures are in place if you don't have the right communication and the trust built up. So what these women were dealing with was, a lack of understanding around how decisions had been made in businesses, of what assets are or were that they inherited. And this just was such a struggle for them that was really unnecessary. And it's not only heirs being daughters, it's also spouses that were left with a mess that could have been avoided or at least made less difficult.
So we spoke to 11 incredible women in the sense that they all somehow found recipes and found ways to to handle the situation, to learn their lessons, to create resources out of thin air and somehow make a success of their time with the family enterprise. Marina, what stood out to you in terms of what was your favorite strategy or resource or conclusion that our interviewees came to when it came to navigating these choppy waters?
I think what was really interesting was how these women so intentionally went around strengthening their voices. There was this kind of active building up of hard skills, soft skills, coaches, mentors. They kind of realized that they didn't want to do it on their own. They couldn't do it on their own. And what did they need? Yes, education is an element of it, but education isn't everything. They didn't need to be validated by getting the degrees. An MBA helped in many cases, but they sought to create networks around themselves. They sought coaches so that they could kind of be transformed personally into leaders. And it was all of these things that helped them believe in themselves. They found their authentic voices. And I thought that was what was incredible when the women truly came into their own power and realized why they were doing it. And they weren't just doing it to please someone else. That's when they became really successful leaders, when they were able to transform their boards, their businesses just exploded. And that was just amazing to see how consciously they kind of like, I need this support. I need these resources. If you want me to take in this, to, sit on this board or take this responsibility, I'm going to need this kind of support. So they not only found their voices and what they needed, sometimes it was financial literacy, whatever it was, to feel better equipped, but they also demanded it of the system around them. If you want me here, this is what I'm going to need from you. And that was great to see.
For me, I asked this question differently from Meghan, just because, Meghan, you've been through the joining, and I was really wondering while we were doing this how this felt for you when you were listening to how women coped. What kind of strategies sounded familiar to you in terms of, like, how to sort of like get your footing in the family enterprise? If some of the things you're like, I wish I'd thought of that when I was going through some of the difficulties I was facing.
I mean, it's like it was kind of painful. I mean, even my ascension into the chairman role was not fraught free, we'll say. It was really challenging. And, of the kind of dynamics that I experienced, it was the most kind of painful to have kind of bias from family. That's like, okay, you know me. You're supposed to love me, or at least, you know like who I am at my essence, and recognize, I am not an evil person. So that was very confusing. Other kind of, weird dynamics I experienced, either in the boardroom or elsewhere, was like a little bit funny. I mean, obviously it was troubling because I needed to be effective, but it was like kind of hysterical. Like, really, you're going to pull this? Like, you are a professional adult who's been in the workforce for decades. So like that was like the kind of the two experiences. And I actually had two different reactions to, my experience. One was like, from the family, it was kind of pain and hurt, which I worked a lot on and now have, resolved. But like it was like kind of, painful on one side and outrage on like kind of the professional side, like, other things. So that was like kind of the lens that I was going into this with. And hearing these stories, I mean, first of all, I felt the pain and outrage for each one of them, and in every story. And there were stories that I heard where I was like, I couldn't even sit still anymore. I had to like, piece the room because I was so outraged on their behalf. No one should be treated like this ever. But secondly, the pain that many of these women experienced from the treatment they received from their own family and even their own parents, fathers, that to me is like nothing more painful than that, because of all the people who should know you and know your capabilities and know your grit and resilience. It's these people who've known you literally your whole life.
The implication of a lot of these conversations is that the whole pressure and the whole responsibility lies with the women to change and mold themselves into shapes and forms that don't come naturally to them and that correspond to the systems that exist, but not to their own strength, and sort of like not putting them in a position where they can truly thrive. And this was actually one of the biggest impacts we also saw, right? Like almost every one of these women, by joining their family enterprise, changed the culture, changed the governance of the family business. Others introduced insane innovation levels, right? Like, so, and I think that's like sort of the impact that they have. And I actually mostly get annoyed about in this conversation that I'm still having to argue that case. Like, why is it great to have women on board? Are you kidding me? Like, why do we still have to discuss this? Like, the results are so tangible. So why do we still have to have this part of the conversation? Why can't we just look to changing the systems as opposed to changing the women? I don't know how you experience that also when it comes to like exchanging with all these fellow chairs, like all these women who've gotten to the highest possible level in the organizational ladder, right? Like, and still we're having to have like this level of peer support and understanding because it's just so hard.
You mentioned something about kind of authenticity, and that was one of the real themes that I saw in a lot of these stories with when we were kind of asking people to share the arc of their journey. How did you get in? Did you experience? What is it like now? So you really got to kind of see the before, the middle, and now kind of, and the now, which is essentially, the after the struggle, because all these women are very well, secured and in their positions, and th're very effective. And I think it's based on just kind of, not all of them really said the word, but a lot of them really did talk about their challenges with finding the right style of leadership and finding who they are as a leader in determining, and Marina, you mentioned the culture as like the culture is, what you want the culture to be. And so they really putting, not carrying the torch of what was. I know, obviously, you want to keep the things that are working well, but not, a whole hog. You definitely need to analyze it and figure out what's working, what's not working, and, take some steps to make some moves. And I think that's, there was this kind of struggle to find a place. And I mean, this is really, Ramya, what you're saying is there was a struggle to find out who they could be. And there is a certain level of vulnerability. And there's a certain level of like, I don't really care anymore now, like, how you're going to judge me or think of me. But that kind of shedding of the stuff that's not working, the mantle of what was before, even if it was, 100-year legacy of something that needed to change, like it was okay to kind of take that leap and change it. And I think that was the true blossoming of authenticity.
I do want to talk briefly about why the three of us are so motivated to continuing this particular conversation. So why do we want to have more research about this? And a large part of what's been said today kind of like already confirms that. I think what is extremely important is that from my perspective, we talk a lot about women in these situations and we don't talk enough with women and we don't let women talk enough about it. But maybe from the two of you as well, Marina, in particular, you, I know you have like very strong views on why you think us like continuing exploring this topic to this extent and in this depth is going to be very, very important in the future.
It is so important to continue this. And I want to talk also about it's about women, but it is about the men. It's about the boys, because the way we've been doing things affects the whole family. It's encouraging the boys to take on the hard skills. They also need the soft skills. They also need to be given choices. They also need to be heard and asked what they wanted. And the sons and the daughters, the husbands, the wives, everyone deserves to be given the same opportunities. And it's not about developing the next CEO. It's about developing each individual family member's potential and leadership potential, because succession doesn't always go to plan. Even if there's communication, even if there's trust, even if there are structures, sometimes there's an unexpected death, there's anything. So it's about how do you equip? And so I work with families, helping them feel emotionally and financially prepared for a transition as a wealth holder. And we see this work that we've been doing with women, like you said, it's about giving them opportunities to speak, to tell their own stories. And it's so that women, men, next generation family members out there realize that they're not alone, that these struggles are happening everywhere. And what can they do that makes it a little bit easier? Is it a peer group? Is it financial literacy? Is it learning how the board is working? And here's a scary statistic: 80% of women die on their own, 80% of men die married. So it's not just the next generation, it's the older generation. How were they being supported? How were they being informed? Who did they talk to? Where do they get the information? And as advisors and as family members, how do we make sure that people's values are built into the services that they're getting, that they're listened to instead of being prescribed? We can talk about governance and families should have it, and estate planning, of course, it's important. But unless you have these relationships, unless you have this confidence, unless you know that you're not alone, it doesn't really mean much at the end of the day. So I think it's so important if we can continue this research that families out there of every generation can see what other tools other people are using to equip themselves.
I really couldn't agree more. And I think, one of the biggest, I mentioned this earlier, but it's like so haunting me, is what is happening to these heir apparents of these women that we interviewed who were not the first choice. Many of those first choices died from drug addiction or alcohol, or, they're still suffering from alcohol or depression and things like that. And that to me is like the biggest tragedy, that people's lives are being destroyed from the pressure of being chosen first. And imagine if if you had a family where everybody, I mean, first of all, it didn't even have to be a family member. By the way, you can have an outside CEO. Like, there are other choices. You don't have to destroy family members in order to be able to carry on this amazing, incredible legacy that changes people's lives, right? I also think that I agree with you, Marina. Nobody should be doing this by themselves. And if from this research, if we can help, anybody, particularly women, in shortening the path. We heard of women who were going through years long struggles to kind of, get to that kind of authentic self where they were really ultra successful and room for themselves and room for the family business. And I think that's if we can shorten people's paths, if we can develop resources, if we can, find those peer groups and help people, get set up where it makes sense to me. That's one of the best things that anybody could do. If ever I have a struggle or a challenge, I'm always motivated to help people get through those similar struggles and challenges faster or better than I did, because it kind of makes my journey more worth it. But I find these stories, very inspiring. I celebrate all of the successes of everybody who we spoke with. It's been really, really special journey. And, one of the biggest benefits is having to have met and worked with you both. It's been such a privilege.